I'm talking with Sneakers Corner, Mel from Sneakers Corner. On his channel, he does a bunch of work on the historical origins of Islam. He's really into looking at the very early period of Islam. This is the least certain period, so he has a lot of tough work to do, but he puts out a lot of good videos, brings scholarship down to a level that average people can understand. I'm going to ask him to open us with a word of prayer to get us started.
Yeah, it's absolutely brilliant to speak to you again on the channel. Before I say the prayer, I just want to say the significance of this prayer. So back in the 3rd and 4th centuries, the Egyptian and Syriac monks used to go into caves and they used to pray constantly all day, and they used to say the Jesus prayer. And they found that when they were traveling, they couldn't throw stones into a bucket very easily, so they created a prayer rope. And I believe that this prayer rope, which had 33 beads, was what the Muslims borrowed in their early tradition. And so instead of the Jesus prayer, they said Subhanallah, which is glory to Allah. So I think it's very appropriate to use the Jesus prayer to start. So, Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Amen.
Amen. So today we're going to be looking at a biography of Muhammad, trying to put one together from a historical perspective rather than the usual method of just taking the Islamic sources at face value and saying, well, that's what they say, so that's what happened. So why don't you start by telling us, where do we get most of our biographical information about Muhammad from?
Well, yeah, the first thing is the Muslims tend to take the Hadith, which was the earliest sources for them, but actually there are sources before that. But the problem with this is the Hadith are the result of widespread fraud. For example, if I quote from Robert Hoyland, he said that one legal scholar had said, "I spent a year sitting with Umar the First's son, Abdallah, who died in 693, and I did not hear him transmit anything from the Prophet." So that's just one example of how people were saying that they had got hadiths from certain people, yet people on the ground at the time said, well, we never heard him say any of these things. Robert Hoyland goes on to say, not much later, though, the idea had won some grassroots support, as we learned from another scholar writing around 740, who observes, "I never heard Jabir ibn Zaid, who died 720, say the Prophet said blah, blah, blah. And yet the young men around here are saying it 20 times an hour." So I think that's a great insight into what was going on in the early part of the 8th century. A lot of these hadiths were being produced after about 700. And by 760, people like Ibn Ishaq was putting together the first Sirah. And he was using a lot of the material from these hadiths, which were just widespread fraud. So he used the most unreliable sources that he could have used. In fact, he could have used some sources from the 7th century, which would have made more sense. And you know, there are at least 12. There are at least 12 existing sources which he might have used. Now, it's a good chance that he may not have been aware of these sources, but luckily for us, we have these sources. And so what I've been doing over the past few months is I've been looking at those sources. Now, some Muslims out there might say, well, you know, you're saying that our sources aren't reliable, but we think they're very reliable. Well, Al-Bukhari, whose hadith collection is referred to as Sahih, which means authentic, he admits that only 7,397 hadith out of 600,000 were used for his hadith collection. Now, if we analyze that, that means that he thought only 1% of the hadith were reliable. Now, out of that 1%, if you look at them, an awful lot of them are completely mythological and farcical. So that just tells you the degree of which these hadiths were fanciful at best, not very historically reliable.
Yeah, that's pretty shocking there, that he looked at 600,000 hadith and he's saying, of all these stories I've collected, only 1% of them I think are real. That's like,
Yeah.
What the other 99%, if if this is the best 1%, and there's things that are clearly wrong in those, uh, what about that other 99%? It really just reinforces the idea of the scholar you referred to saying that people up are just making up stuff. 20 different hadiths an hour they're making up. So it's like
Yeah,
take any thought you have whatsoever and attribute it to Muhammad.
absolutely. Um, when the storytellers were challenged on the veracity of their accounts, they were just as adept at inventing believable chains of narration. So lies were used to buttress lies, and you can see how that would just grow the thing exponentially. So it's kind of laughable now, hearing Muslims say, "Oh, we have a chain of narration." Well, who invented the chain of narration? It's the same storytellers. It's like, trust me, I'm a liar. It's farcical. And of course, none of the sources that are using are from early written records. They're all oral tradition that eventually was put together, and we're not even sure if the al-Bukhari's collection was put together in the 9th century. There are some that say that it might have been put together much later than the 9th century, which makes it even less reliable. Um, so if we turn to Ibn Ishaq's and Ibn Hashim's Sirah, which was written at the earliest 130 years after Muhammad died, and possibly 200 years if we take the later edition. We just take an example that just shows clearly that it is a mythology and not a history. Just a short quote, referring to Muhammad's mother. It says, "While she was carrying the child in her womb, she saw a light issue from her which illuminated even the castles of Bosra in Syria."
That sounds really
So,
historical.
yeah, it does. just like a massive torch going around, lighting up castles. Now, there's so many problems with just that one line. Like, hey, what's she doing in Bosra in Syria? That's like southern Syria. Isn't she supposed to be from either Medina or Mecca, or at least halfway down Arabia? But she's way up in the wrong location. Um, and the maddening thing, he doesn't even say that Muhammad was born in Bosra. It makes an allusion to that, but he avoids saying he was born there. It also says in the Sirah the people in Mecca celebrated on the roofs when he was born, but doesn't say he was born there. So again, avoiding saying he was born. And another time he says, in relation to Medina, it reports an already born Muhammad being brought to Medina looking for a wet nurse. But again, it doesn't actually say he was born in Medina, so it leaves the most important detail of his biography totally ambiguous. So it's not very reliable. On top of that, when I was looking at the Sirah, and I literally only give it a cursory look, and anyone can do this. It only took me about an hour just to have a scan over it. There's so many parallels between it and the Gospels that you can see clearly that what they were doing is they had the Gospels open in one hand, and they had their document in the other hand, and they were writing down ideas based on the Gospels, and they're trying to big up Muhammad to say he was even better than Jesus was. So, for example, Matthew's Gospel has a genealogy. Muhammad has a genealogy, whereas Jesus had a Star of Bethlehem. They had to do even better than that. So they had a combination of John's prenatal encounter with Jesus and Muhammad shining in the womb. So that's how combined it. So Muhammad became the Star of Bethlehem in their version. In place of looking for an end, they have a weird story where you have Hamina comes into Medina on a donkey. Does that remind you of something? And she,
Yeah,
instead of look,
Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem.
so she's coming into Medina on a donkey. Also kind of reminds us of Mary maybe coming into Bethlehem on a donkey, but she's looking for a baby to suckle, right? So she's going around door to door looking for a baby, which is kind of strange.
I'd say so.
And then at the same time, just by pure coincidence, Muhammad as a baby has been brought from house to house looking for a wet nurse. And all the women in Medina are refusing him. And how dare they refuse the baby prophet? And how stupid are they? So they completely went crazy with this story. You can see they just borrowed the story of looking for an N and came up with this ridiculous story. Then again, you have in, say, Luke's gospel, Jesus gets lost in the temple. Guess what? Muhammad gets lost around the Kaaba. So not a lot of imagination in the story. We have Mary and Joseph travel south from Nazareth to Bethlehem, and then in Ibn Ishaq's story, he suggests that Muhammad's mother traveled from Busra to Medina. Only kind of vaguely suggested, and again, there's an echo of the Gospels. So the problem with the Hadith and Sirah is that they are 8th and 9th century creations. We need to get sources from the 7th century, and ideally as early as possible, that are free from polemics. And as I've pointed out, the Sirah is just full of mythologies.
So before getting into the sources that we think are more reliable, I have a couple comments from the chat here. Fishbones asked, wasn't the Hadith and Quran written in the 8th to 10th century? Our position is that the Hadith were written no earlier than the 9th century, probably. Written down, they could have, in theory, been generated somewhat earlier. And we think the Quran was probably written in the very late 7th century. Would you agree with that?
In terms of the Hadith, there might have been earlier Hadiths from the early 8th century. In terms of the Quran, that's a huge question. I'd be inclined to say anything that sort of remotely resembles the Quran today only starts to come together in the early part of the 8th century. So I would probably put the Quran a little bit later. And I would also suggest that there's very little evidence connect Muhammad with the Quran. There's not a single piece of solid evidence. Now, it could be that the Quran is a reconstruction of what people thought Muhammad was teaching at the time, in which case it becomes a completely worthless document. At best, it's speculation. It could be that they had a collection of things that he had said written down, but actually the only things that we can reliably say that Muhammad said are actually from the 7th century sources, and if you were to add them up together, you have only about 3 sentences. So it's not a lot.
Hassan Ahmed just pointed out that the earliest Bukhari manuscript is from the 11th century, and I was going to mention that as well.
There we go. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean it could be still being modified as late as the 11th century. That's the only thing we can say for sure, that it couldn't be later than the 11th century. But of course, that's already 400 years after Muhammad. And then Muslims come to us and they're like, your material on Jesus isn't reliable, i.e. the Gospels. You only have copies from 100 years after he lived. You don't have any from the first 100 years. And
like the thing is, just to make a point on this, if you throw out the Sirah and the Hadith, what have you left? You've got a book that almost no one can properly understand, and the rest is just pure speculation. So the whole house of cards collapses very quickly once you take out the Hadith and Sirah. That's why it's so damaging, all of this stuff.
And then just one more comment before we move on. Fishburne said oral tradition only to be written 300 years later. I think he's saying that the oral tradition wasn't written down for 300 years, which is, more or less accurate. The key part, though, isn't necessarily that it took a long time to write it down. It's that what we do have has the marks of mythology, because information can be accurately transmitted orally. We're not saying that it's 100% unreliable. But what you do have written down looks like legend, looks like borrowing from earlier myths, then you can't trust it. You can say that this is clearly not historical material.
Yeah, and actually, the impression I got, I started with an open mind with Ibn Ishaq, but the impression I get is that he intentionally fabricated material. That it wasn't just he was in ignorance of the sources. He intentionally put together things that he knew was false, and that's very damning. So it means that how reliable is any of the material,
Yeah, and I think that Muslims would actually agree with that one. They don't like Ibn Ishaq. They say that he made up stuff, that he's unreliable. But his material looks a lot like the Hadith material. If he's making stuff up,
It
then everyone's making stuff up.
absolutely. The thing I would say is the biography of Muhammad is like a house of it's like a house with core elements. The date and location of his birth is the foundation. The date and manner of his death is the roof. The date of his religious conversion and his religious attitude, beliefs, and views are the walls, and the furniture are his wives. So I think we're probably going to see this house collapse this evening, and we're going to see a much smaller, compact house at the end, which is probably closer to the reality.
Uh,
And one other thing I would say just very quickly is my methodology is to use 7th century sources and any prior to the Sirah, so pre 760, and those that quote from such sources. I would also say on a spectrum from extreme skepticism, say over here, and extreme credulity, I'm going to apply a moderate level of skepticism, so somewhere halfway in between. I'm aware the sources are scarce and we don't have the luxury of perfect sources, so I'm going to be moderately skeptical. And the aim of this inquiry is not to apply a wrecking ball necessarily to the house, but to reinstate it back to what it was in the 7th century.
Excellent.
So that's the
Sounds
plan
like a
anyway.
good plan. So why don't we start with that foundation? So Muslims say Muhammad was born in 570. What
Okay.
is your opinion?
Yeah. My case is that the date of his birth is wrong. I would say it wasn't 570. I think it was much later, 591, and I'm going to show you why I think that is the case. So the traditional date of Muhammad's religious enlightenment or conversion of 610 fits well with the circumstances on the ground. So that's one part of the story which I think is grounded in history. Robert Hoyland reports that one chronicle records that in 610 a band of Arabs came out of Arabia into the regions of Syria. They pillaged and laid waste many lands, committed many massacres of men, and burned without compassion or pity. So that fits in with him having a kind of an epiphany in 610. So what age would I expect him to be in 610? One clue is he wasn't 40 when he had the religious conversion, but much younger. Well, at least what I'm saying here is that the clue that I'm going to look at would suggest that he wasn't 40. When I first heard the story of Muhammad, I thought it was a bit weird that he was 40 when all of this started. I just thought that was very late, and short of accepting that he was having a midlife crisis, I just didn't think that made sense,
Uh,
that someone would take that long.
and to pause you right there, 40 is also considered like the age of a generation or the perfect age, that kind of thing. So
Yeah,
there's probably a good reason why they made him exactly 40.
yeah, absolutely. So just to back up my point, the Chronicle of Theophilus of Edessa, which was written in 750 and is now lost. However, it was discovered that the Greek Chronicle of Theophanes, written in 814, and the Syriac Chronicle of Michael the Syrian of 1195 both used it as a common source. One such chronicle that used this common source was the Syriac Chronicle of 1234. So even though this is, as you can see, very late, because all of these documents are sharing a common source and have a lot of similarities between them, I think we can reliably say that it is from this Chronicle of 750. So what it says is the following. Therefore this Muhammad, while in the measure and stature of youth, began to go up and down from his city Yathrib to Palestine for the business of buying and selling. And while he was engaged in this region, he encountered the belief in one God, and it was pleasing to his eyes. And when he went back down to the people of his tribe, he set this belief before them, and when he persuaded a few, they followed him. And at the same time, he would extol for them the excellence of the land of Palestine, saying that, and here's a quote, because of belief in the one God, such a good and fertile land has been given to them. And he would add, if you listen to me, God will also give you a fine land flowing with milk and honey, end quote. And when he wanted to prove his word, he led a band of those who were obedient to him, began to go up and down and plunder the land of Palestine, taking captives and pillaging. And he returned laden with booty and unharmed, and he did not fall short of his promise to them. Now, the key thing I would say from all of that is it says that when all of this happened, he was in the measure and stature of youth. So I would say that a reasonable age, a guesstimate, we can call it that, would be that he was around 18, which would put his birth at around 592 or thereabouts, maybe 591, 593. So that's our first clue out of the way. Do you want to comment on that before I move on to our second clue?
Yeah, I mean, that seems pretty reasonable. Certainly a 40-year-old couldn't be called a youth. Maybe, I mean, 18 might be a little precise. You could say 16 to 25 or something, but
yeah. I would think that was reasonable. The reason why I went against 16 and thought it might be a bit older is the fact that he went back and he had enough stature to persuade others to be believers in this. I would have thought 16, it might be a bit difficult for a 16-year-old to persuade others to follow him. Your average 16-year-old, I don't think, is capable of that, but maybe 17, 18 and onwards, I think is probably more likely. So that's the only reasoning behind that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But,
especially if, people are generally considered adults around 14 or 15 in the culture, which was, common in most ancient cultures. So if you're 14 as an adult, 16, that might be a little young to be leading people, but 18 seems pretty reasonable.
Okay. So my second clue, to summarize it, is that Ibn Ishaq says that he was born, and he says two things, in the year of the elephant, and that it was 570. So there's two interconnected things: the year and the year of the elephant, and an actual number 570. Now, because Ibn Hisham edited the book later, we don't know if that 570 was a later edition or not. It's not clear. There's even an asterisk in my version of it, so it's very vague there. But both of these statements can't be true because there was no such event, the year of the elephant, as I'm going to show you in 570. So, first of all, I'm going to quote you Ibn Ishaq's passage. He says, the Apostle of Allah was born on a Monday, very precise, on the 13th day of the month of Rabi in the year of the elephant, circa 570. And he says in brackets, the year of an invasion by the Abyssinians, which is the Ethiopians, whose army was made memorable in Arabia by having an elephant in its train. Okay, so that's in Ibn Ishaq's passage. Now, interestingly, before he mentions this, he earlier on in the Sirah, he tells the story of Abraha. So when you come across this reference, you know exactly what he means, that the year of the elephant is definitely to do with Abraha. Okay, so that's important. Now, let me see. I have written here a reference to why Sarah is unreliable, but I'm going to skip that little bit and just stay focused on what we're going to talk about. So what's wrong with 570? So I'm going to be referring to a paper by a guy called Daniel A. Beck, who has a paper called Maccabees, Not Mecca, the Biblical Subtext of Surah al-Fil. He says the traditional Islamic context of Surah al-Fil, the enigmatic Surah al-Fil, has long been understood as recounting an attempted siege of Mecca by King Abraha, an Ethiopian Christian ruler of Yemen. As related by Ibn Kathir, Du Nuwas was a Jewish Himyarite king who killed 20,000 Christians in fiery trenches and is the background of Surah 85. And try not to go on too much here, but just to give you an idea, at the urging of the Byzantines, the Ethiopian king sought revenge, dispatching a great army into Yemen, headed up by Aryat and Abraha. Du Nuwas was killed by drowning in the sea. Abraha then defeated Aryat in a duel, seizing control of Yemen. To appease the Ethiopian king's anger regarding his coup, Abraha built a gigantic Christian church in Sana'a. and tried to force the Arabs to make their pilgrimage there. This angered the Quraysh, who saw the new church as a competitive threat to the Meccan pilgrimage. So basically, just to cut the story short, the Quraysh desecrated the church and eventually burnt it down. And so Abraha decided to punish the Quraysh, and he headed north to Mecca with an elephant called Mahmud, which is funny for Arab speakers because that's a play on the word Muhammad. So why would they call the elephant Muhammad? Um, and the problem is that Yemen naturally lacks elephants. So the helpful Ethiopian king had Mahmud shipped across with 12 other elephants. And the ridiculous claim is that they sent the elephants all this way just to hold down the Kaaba. I don't understand why they couldn't have just used a bunch of camels. It would have made more practical sense. And so what happened then later is, as Abraha's expedition advanced, its lead elephant, Mahmud, knelt down when directed towards the Kaaba and refused to budge. When turned in any other direction, Mahmud began walking, but when pointed towards the Kaaba, he knelt reverentially, no matter how he was beaten. After Mahmud's devoted prostration stalled the expedition short of Mecca, Allah sent birds from the sea who dropped tiny stones on Abraha's army. All who were struck perished, both from impact and from pestilence, including Abraha himself, who died from rotting flesh on his return journey. So that's according to the Islamic tradition. Sounds very convincing, very historical. Now, there are a load of problems with this as a historical story. First problem is, why would Surah 105 cheer the defeat of the monotheistic Ethiopian Christians at the hands of the pagan Quraysh? That makes no sense. Why would Allah intervene to save church-burning polytheists from Christians? And why would Muhammad recite 105, Surah 105, to remind his Meccan followers about an episode when Allah recently intervened to save the mushrihun, or the polytheists, from the people of the book? That doesn't make any sense. It's a contradiction. And why go to the folly of using elephants to besiege Mecca? Just makes no practical sense. Now, here's the interesting thing, and this is major. Abraha did make an expedition to the Hijaz, so that part is true. There is an inscription in South Arabia written in Sabaean, which is a script that the people of Yemen used, and also people in the Hijaz used. And it records the victory of Abraha's forces at an oasis called Taraban, which is located 100 kilometers east of Taif. So it kind of sounds right. And it's about 100 kilometers to the southeast of Mecca. So we're really thinking this must be historically accurate then. However, the problem is it wasn't dated in 570. It was dated in 553. So there is your story blown out of the water. It's 17 years too early. So it's clearly not true. Mm-hmm. And Abraha died shortly afterwards. So you can't even say, well, it was a later expedition. So that's killed out of the water. And also, there's a historian called Procopius who wrote about Abraha's rise to power, but he never mentions any use of war elephants on that expedition, which you think he would, considering it's such an unusual thing. There is also no contemporary historical record of any attack on Mecca with or without elephants, and any antagonism between the Christian ruler Abraha and a polytheistic pilgrimage to the Kaaba in Mecca. The other problem is African elephants are not as amenable as Indian elephants to be trained in this way, making it highly implausible. Even to train Indian elephants is quite difficult, to get them to do this sort of thing. But African elephants is a non-starter. Now, the other thing that he says is that Surah 105, on which this myth is based, is more likely an allusion to 2 and 3 Maccabees, which features the Maccabees defeating war elephants. So that ends our kind of discussion on that. It's clearly they've got things all muddled up here. So why do I think 591 then is more plausible for the idea that Muhammad was born in 591? So there's a guy called Bahram Shoban who started a rebellion in 589 to 591 against the Sasanian king Hormizd IV, who was killed. However, the king's son was crowned, and he's called Khusro II. Emperor Maurus supported Khusro's return to power. In 591, Khusro II and his Byzantine allies invaded Bahram Shoban's territories in Mesopotamia, where they successfully managed to defeat him, while Khusro II regained the throne. Shoban therefore fled to the territory of the Turks in Transoxiana, and Saramiz the Elder was also sent to stop Bahram, who defeated him and had him trampled to death by elephants. And this occurred in 591. This is likely the historical basis of the year of the elephant, which would mean that if there was any basis to saying that Muhammad was born in the year of the elephant, it's more likely 591, which would mean that the event in 610 when he had his conversion would mean that he was 19 at the time. So my guess was 18. So 19 is close enough.
Very good. So seems you have a couple independent clues that would place Muhammad's birth in the early 590s. I think that's probably about as definitive as we can get for a birth date. Obviously, birth dates are rarely recorded. Only, sons of the emperor would have their birth date recorded in a historical book. Of course, their family knew, but those records are long gone. So I think that's a reasonable guess. Valonius asks, what date were you referring to for the story of the pilgrimage of Mecca prior to Muhammad's birth? The story that mentioned it.
Oh, the Abraha story? 553.
So way too early.
So way too early, 17 years too early. That would make Muhammad about 80 or something when he was doing a lot of his stuff late, It's not, totally wrong,
Very good. So we have an approximate birth date of, say, 591. What about Muhammad's death? Is 632 reliable, or do you have other ideas on that one?
Well, let's just start with the idea that every encyclopedia in the world repeats the claim that Muhammad died in 632. So if I'm going to go up against that, I'm like, seems ridiculous and totally implausible that how could all the encyclopedias in the world get it wrong? But this, again, is all based on Ibn Ishaq's legendary account of Muhammad. It's all resting on him. There's nothing before that says he died in 632. Before I go into it, I'd like to refer to the Columbus myth, right? I don't know if this was true of you growing up, but when I was a young lad in school and I looked at the encyclopedia at the time, I was told that the people at the time of Columbus thought the world was flat. And so they were saying, oh, don't go west along the Atlantic, you're going to go over the edge and so on. I just thought that was true. And then later, I found out that it was Washington Irving that started this legend back in the 19th century at a time of very strong anti-clericalism. And of course, people bought up the story because they're saying, oh, these stupid Christians, they didn't know the world was round. But actually, it was totally wrong because people knew from the time of the Greeks that the world was a sphere, and people had access to all of these sources, and all of the universities which were started by Christians had these sources. So no one who was anyways educated believed that. Now, if a myth can start in the 19th century, well, you can be certain that a myth could easily start in the 7th or 8th century. So my case, and this might be unbelievable for many people, my case is that the date of his death is wrong. I would say he wasn't 632, but I can confidently say that it was 636. He died at the age of 45, not 62, as claimed. I think I may be the first person on YouTube to ever make this claim. I may be wrong. So this is quite a big claim. So you heard it first. Recent answers. Multiple 7th century sources back a post-634 date. So our very early sources, there are 12 in total from the 7th century that say he was living past 632. That's incredible stuff. Now, the paradigm of him being 40, do you remember we mentioned that earlier when he had his conversion? This, and then having 20 years spent roughly as a prophet, this is designed to be half that of Moses, because according to the Bible, Moses was 80 when he became a prophet, and then he spent 40 years wandering in the desert. So that whole part of Muhammad's story is artificial. So that is the reason why this stuck to 632 no matter what, even though a lot of people knew that he died much later. I don't know how they managed to push this crazy date through, but obviously the Surah was written 130 years later, and just a lot of people just didn't know. So where are we going to say? So I'm saying that Ibn Ishaq pushed back his date of birth to 570, and this was not a mistake on his part, but a premeditated deception for ideological purposes. In Ibn Ishaq's account, Muhammad's death seems to follow closely on his farewell pilgrimage to Mecca, which he appears to locate in 10 AH or 632. This is a deduction derived purely from his arrangement of the stories, but he doesn't actually straightforwardly say that he died in 632. So an awful lot of this is people's assumption based on the arrangement of the stories, but he doesn't spell that out clearly. Shoemaker, this is Stephen Shoemaker, points out that his is the first witness to this particular chronology, which later became assumed as fact. So I'm going to present a number of clues why we believe that it was post 632. Just lost it here. Clue number one is there's a written note from 636 which says Muhammad was still alive. That's as early as you can get, 636, and he's alive at the time of the writing of the note. So this is the fragment on the Arab conquest. These are fragmentary notes that were written around the year 636 AD on the front blank pages of a 6th century Syriac Christian manuscript of the Gospel of Mark. This much faded note is preserved on folio 1 of the British Library, addendum 14461. It is noteworthy as it mentions Muhammad directly by name and implies he was alive at the time of writing. This note appears to have been penned soon after the Battle of Gabata in 636, at which the Arabs inflicted a crushing defeat of the Byzantines. Before I read that, do you want to make any comment? Or
No,
shall
I think you can go ahead.
Okay, so here it is. It says, in January, people of Homs took the word for their lives, and many villages were ravaged by the killing of the Arabs of Muhammad, and many people were slain and taken prisoner from Galilee as far as Beth, and the line is cut off. On the 26th of May, the Sakilara went from the vicinity of Homs, and the Romans chased them. On the 10th of August, the Romans fled from the vicinity of Damascus, and there were killed many people, some 10,000. And at the turn of the year, the Romans came. On the 20th of August, in the year 947, there gathered in Gabata a multitude of the Romans, and many people of the Romans were killed, some 50,000. If some of you are confused by the year 947, that is the Greek year, and it equates to 636 AD. So that's our first clue. So the key thing there is, in 636, it's clearly saying that Muhammad was the leader of this army. So it's not saying the Arabs of Abu Bakr or the Arabs of Umar. It's clearly saying it's the Arabs of Muhammad. So just to back that up, in 640, there's another note which says that Muhammad was leading an invasion of Syria in 636. This source is reliably dated to no later than 640. It's referred to as the Thomas the Presbyter source, and it's independent of our first source that we mentioned. It confirms that there was an Arab invasion in Syria in 636 led by a leader called Muhammad. In addition, it tells us that he and his army, referred to as the Tayyi tribe, battled the Romans in Palestine in 634, causing them to flee. Before I get into it, I just want to point out a little bit about the nomenclature, or the names that are used there. Notice that it says that he was the leader of a tribe called Tayeye and not Quraysh. This took me months to work out why there's a discrepancy. And this might be breaking news to some of you, but Muhammad didn't belong to a tribe called Quraysh. The historical sources, and there's a number of them, say that his real tribe was Tayeye, which came from near Medina in Arabia, and some of the tribes split away from that part and moved to Syriac-speaking areas in southern Syria. So that's that tribe. The Quraysh actually is a Syriac word which means an alliance. And this seems to be the name that they gave to an alliance between the various Arab tribes and the Jewish tribes. So therefore, it's not a tribe, it's just a name for an alliance. And that later, like 130 years later, they just assumed meant his tribe, but it wasn't. And in fact, we can say that he was the founder of the Quraysh, which is interesting. But anyway, I jumped the gun a little bit. I don't know if you want to comment on that, or shall I go straight into the source?
Why don't you read the source and then I'll comment.
Okay. In the year 945, in Diction 7, on Friday the 7th of February 634, at the 9th hour, there was a battle between the Romans and the Arabs of Muhammad in Palestine, 12 miles east of Gaza. The Romans fled, leaving behind the patrician Bridren, whom the Arabs killed. Some 4,000 poor villagers of Palestine were killed there, Christians, Jews, and Samaritans. The Arabs ravaged the whole region. In the year 947, in Diction 9, or 636 AD, the Arabs invaded the whole of Syria and went down to Persia and conquered it. The Arabs climbed the mountain of Mardin and killed many monks there in the monasteries of Kedar and Benata. There died the blessed man Simon, doorkeeper of Kedar, brother of Thomas the priest. So based on the preceding, we can say with a high degree of confidence that Muhammad was born in 591 and died in 636, and he died at the age of 45, not 62. If the Hadith and Sirah got such basic things wrong, how can we trust any of it?
So very good. My comment would be that so you got two near contemporary sources that say Muhammad was alive in the mid to late 630s. I think that historically that's about as good as you can ever get. Two independent sources that are clearly able to have knowledge of the event, and they both say basically the same exact thing. That's as good as gold in historical inquiry. So I think it's, even though you're going out on a limb here, I think that the case is really, really solid that Muhammad was alive past 632.
And actually, here's something else. The person who wrote the second one was a priest, and he wrote it, I think that in that one, I can't remember actually, but at least one of them was written in a Bible. That's as good as an oath if you write something in a Bible, you know? So they're clearly confident with the information. And with the second source, we have a priest that wrote it. And priests aren't generally known for telling lies. And what's absent from it is any polemics. He's just telling it as it is. And he probably heard a lot of information being a priest because people would pass through the church and report what's been happening around the countryside. So I think it's a very good source.
That's a good point. It's in addition to being really early, it's really straightforward. It has the marks of authenticity. There's, he's not trying to make the invading army sound terrible. He's just saying there's an army coming to get us, basically.
And here's another thing that rubber stamps it is, at that time they had a way of giving a year which they used what's called an indiction. So in, say, for example, the year 945 is indiction 7. And they had this indiction is kind of like a cycle of years. So if you say 945 and the indiction is the wrong number, then you know the date is wrong. So this is like a rubber stamp way of being absolutely certain that you got the right year. So even if, say, the year was smudged 945, from the indiction you could probably guess what the year was. So that's an extra valuable piece of information there.
Very good. So far we've seen that Muhammad's birth date is way off and his death date's off by a little bit. good place to turn might be his family. So Islamic tradition says that he had as many as 11 wives, and that his first wife he was married to for a long time, but when she died, then he started taking multiple wives. What have you found about Muhammad's marriages?
Yeah, well, to put it briefly, if we refer to the wives as furniture, I'm going to be throwing out a lot of furniture. Uh, so, my case is that Muhammad didn't get married until his conquest of Palestine in either 633 or 634. Well, this is quite a radical claim I'm making, and I can back it up. He was only married once. Now, it may be possible that he married previously and he became a widower. That's possible. But presumably he never married, if that didn't happen, we're talking about just one single wife. He was married only once to a Jewish woman and he died 2 years later. So it was a very short marriage. So that would rule out him having many children as well, possibly no children. We don't know her name, but we can say that um, Aisha can be obtained by applying a hamza or a mini ayn to a Jewish word which is esha, meaning woman. And I'm not entirely certain if that was actually used as a Jewish name, but we get that from Gabriel Salma. So that's quite interesting. Now, I wasn't going to come here tonight to say that Aisha is a real person, but the fact that there's a Jewish connection with her name is quite interesting. So it could be that that's the person that he married. We have a clear indication that the Jews arranged a marriage with a Jewish woman as an act of appeasement with Muhammad. And because the Jews are against polygamy and he died 2 years later, I think it's fair to deduce that he was married only once. And as I say, we don't know her name. So that's my main case that I'm going to make in relation to his wives. Do you want to say anything before I go into the clues? Or
Kind of go into the clues.
okay, so clue one is there was a decision by the Jews to form an alliance with Muhammad to take the Byzantines out because he was able to unify the factions, both political and religious. And first, we know from Sebius that the Jewish leaders sought help from the Arabs and they were willing to form an alliance. So that's actually a key piece of information. I'm not going to go into much information about Sebius apart from the fact that he's writing in the 660s, 661 or thereabouts. Sebius writes, 12 peoples representing all the tribes of the Jews assembled at the city of Edessa. When they saw that the Persian troops had departed, leaving the city in peace, they closed the gates and fortified themselves. They refused entry to troops of the Roman lordship. Thus, Heraclius, emperor of the Byzantines, gave the order to besiege it. When the Jews realized that they could not militarily resist him, they promised to make peace. Opening the city gates, they went before him, and Heraclius ordered that they should go and stay in their own place. So they departed, taking the road through the desert to Tagastan, Arabia, to the sons of Ishmael. The Jews called the Arabs to their aid and familiarized them with the relationship they had through the books of the Old Testament. Although the Arabs were convinced of their close relationship, they were unable to get consensus from their multitude, for they were divided from each other by religion. Before I read on, that's really important. So they were struggling to get consensus. So they need basically one guy, a superhero sort of guy, who can bring all the tribes together. That's going to be key. So continue with the quote. At that time, a certain man from among those same sons of Ishmael, whose name was Muhammad, a merchant, as if by God's command, appeared to them as a preacher and the path of truth. He taught them to recognize the God of Abraham, especially because he was learnt and informed in the history of Moses. Now, because the command was from on high, at a single order, they all came together in unity of religion. So what's quite impressive there is it shows us that he was learned. He wasn't a dummy. He wasn't illiterate. He was learned in the history of Moses. And he had the charisma to bring everyone together, and he had the brain power to do that. So that's quite an interesting thing. Now, obviously, I haven't mentioned anything about a marriage with a Jewish woman. That's going to come with clue 2. So I will continue with clue 2. The Jews, as part of the alliance agreement, offered Muhammad a Jewish wife to cement the alliance, but also as an act of appeasement. So here's my evidence. The Ten Kings Midrash, which is dated to about 744, and used an early source called the Apocalypse of Rabbi Shimon ben Yohei, that is dated between 635 and 645. So as you can see, a very early source. This source and later sources that copy from it indicate that the Jews believed that the Ishmaelites, and especially Muhammad, would free them from the yoke of the Byzantines. All right, so that's quite interesting. They were banking on him as their savior. It says, and this is written by Jews, remember, at the beginning of his dominion, when he goes forth, he will seek to do harm to Israel, but great men of Israel will join him and give him a wife from among them. That indicates a Jewish wife. And there will be a peace between him and Israel. He will conquer all of the kingdom and come to Jerusalem and bow down there and make war with the Edomites, i.e. the Romans. And they will flee before him, and he will seize the kingship by force, and then he will die. So two things I'd like to comment about this before I go on to clue 3. Thomas the Presbyter confirms that he initially sought to harm Israel, as it reports the killing of 4,000 poor Christians, Samaritans, and Jews in Palestine. So that works. Second thing is the Jewish leaders form an alliance from Muhammad through marriage. They offer him a Jewish wife, as this would amount to adultery if he were already married, because they're making the move, not him. This indicates he was not married at the time of 633-64. It is not clear if he was ever married before and became a widower. That bit we're not sure, but certainly at that time, I would argue that he was marrying for the first time.
If I could just point something out before we move on. This source is written a while after the events, but it's kind of casting it in a future tense. This would be, arguably, they could be making it look like a prophecy that obviously has already been fulfilled. So I think that if that is indeed what they're doing, then we can be pretty confident that these events did take place.
Yeah, and the other thing is the tone of it is actually very positive, more, by and large. And if this was written really 100 years later, it's very unlikely that they would have been talking about him as a savior or a liberator or anything like that. Instead, they would have been just saying, he was a murderer, he killed all our people. But you can see there they've preserved their initial impression of Muhammad, which is kind of interesting.
And let me just take care of a couple of quick comments from the chat before we go on. Fishbones asked if you have a channel. He does. It is Sneakers Corner. I put a link in the video description box. After the live stream's over, I'll go ahead and put one in a pinned comment as well.
Yeah.
So go check that out. He does a lot of interesting historical work. And then Villainous said, "My cat is hungry," which is possibly true. I'll see if I can hold her off. But if she starts making too much noise, then I might take a break and feed her.
Yeah, I don't want to be responsible for a hungry cat. Actually, just as a preview, there's going to be a story coming up which is quite explosive that involves a hungry dog or dogs. So there you go. Just look out for this. Okay, so
real quick before you go on, Fishbones just said, "Remember, cats will step on the Quran." If people aren't familiar with that, about a year ago there was a meme going around that a Muslim started that cats wouldn't step on the Quran. So David Wood had to do a response video where he showed cats would indeed step on the Quran.
Yeah. So my clue 3, if I may move on. The chronological charts say Muhammad died 2 years after entering Palestine. So we can deduce that Muhammad lived for only 2 years after his invasion of Palestine by examining the chronological charts of Jacob of Edessa, who wrote in 691-692, so a very early source still. While he gets the date of the beginning of Muhammad's reign and the overall length of his reign wrong, what's interesting, he nonetheless indicates that Muhammad entered Palestine during the 5th year and dies during the 7th year, which would mean that he dies 2 years into his marriage to his Jewish wife. Now, obviously, the fact that he gets quite a lot of details wrong could make us think, well, we're not going to take this as a piece of evidence. But maybe if he just managed to get one thing right, we could say that he died in 2 years after he got married. So that would indicate he died in, say, 636. So he married in 634. So that kind of fits pretty well.
Very good. So we have three sources for Muhammad's conquest of Jerusalem, or I'm sorry, of the Jewish people anyway. Was this
Yeah.
Jerusalem or?
Yeah, I think it was more general, so
Okay,
Palestine
yeah.
and the invasion of Syria as well. So he was alive during both of those invasions.
So we'll just say of the Jewish territory, and maybe it's not an ironclad case that he got married to a Jewish woman and wasn't married already, but at the same time, it's perfectly ordinary event for there to be a political marriage in this type of
Yeah,
situation. So it's reasonably plausible.
yeah. Actually, I would back up what you just said. I'm not saying this is 100%, but I'm saying it's quite. My case is plausible, at least. Yeah,
Certainly more plausible than the traditional story, anyway.
yeah, yeah. Absolutely, that wouldn't be hard.
uh, so we kind of alluded to this a bit already when you're discussing those sources, but what did the Jews think of Muhammad?
Well, actually, just before I come to that, I'd like to talk about how old was his Jewish wife, if I may, before we move on to that.
Sure.
Yeah. So there's nothing in the early sources that suggests her age. Okay, so that's a bit disappointing. But the absence suggests that there was nothing out of the ordinary, I would say. I know that there's a problem with arguing from absence of evidence, but that's quite telling. If we suppose Aisha to be that wife, okay, so that's a big if. And if we can assume Al-Tabari can be relied upon, which is doubtful, he says that all of Abu Bakr's children were born in pre-Islamic times, which would include Aisha, right? Now, if you ask many Muslims what is pre-Islamic, some might say pre-Hijra, some might say pre-610, when Muhammad had his great revelation. So if we say pre-Hijra, that would mean that Aisha was at least 12. So that throws out all of those hadiths with Aisha being such a young girl, okay? Well, 6 and 9 and that kind of thing. Or more plausibly, if we say that the pre-Islamic period is pre-610, that means that she was at least 24 years old, which sounds much more credible for someone called the Praised One. I'd be inclined to go with the pre-610, and then the story becomes quite normal. Aisha being 24, 25, smart woman, she obviously had a huge impact, and could probably be relied upon to lead the people after Muhammad's death. So that's that bit.
Looks like Sayed F is in the chat, and he'll be happy to hear that because he loves to argue that Aisha was 18. It's one of his
Yeah, well,
favorite copy and paste comments.
yeah, well, there you go. You might just be right there. And as I say, I'm being perfectly, you know, unbiased here. I'm not trying to push Muhammad around. And actually, as you'll probably find, most of what I'm going to say about Muhammad is actually relatively positive. So I'm not here just to rubbish him or throw mud at him. I'm just saying this is what the early sources tell us.
But I just want to point out, though, that if you deny the accuracy of the Hadith, you're in a lot of trouble as a Muslim because the vast majority of Islam is based on the Hadith, not the Quran.
Absolutely, yeah. So
So
it's a problem either way.
yeah, it's a
You're damned
lose-lose
if you do,
situation.
damned if you don't. Yeah.
All right, so let's move
So
on.
so yeah.
What did the Jewish people who were writing these early sources think about Muhammad?
Okay, so well, our first clue on this, a Jewish source from 635-645 says they thought he was possessed and crazy. So not very positive there, but in The Secrets of Rabbi Shimon ben Yohei, written in 744, another based on the Apocalypse of Rabbi Shimon ben Yohei from 635-645, we get the Jewish assessment of Muhammad. And here I quote, "He raises over them a crazy prophet possessed by a spirit, and he conquers the land for them." So there you have it. That's their assessment. Thought he's a bit crazy. It was kind of like making an alliance with the devil, basically. They want to be free of the Byzantians, and they don't care who they make the alliance with. It'll suit their ends. And that sounds quite credible. It wasn't a rosy relationship they had.
Very good. Um, so I know that this next subject is the one that you are most interested in talking about, and that is, how did Muhammad die?
Yeah, and where did he die, and where was he buried? I do warn Muslims to, if you are of a sensitive nature, the next bit that I'm going to talk about is going to be maybe a bit upsetting. But just remember that I am just quoting an early Islamic tradition here, and it is not my own opinion. So my case is Muhammad didn't die in Medina of poison consumed in Khaybar, as Ibn Ishaq claims 130 years after his death, but instead he died of a wound or a massacre, which is based on one 7th century source, while in battle in Syria in 636. Right. So here's my first clue. A tradition is attributed to Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri in the works of the early Hadith compiler Abdul al-Razzaq, sorry, I may not be able to say this very well, Abdul al-Razzaq al-Sanani. I'm sorry, Arab speakers, I'm ruining the language there, but in which the unnamed figure is a Rabbi Tema. The rabbi warns Abu Talib against bringing Muhammad to Syria, right? As he predicts that Muhammad will be killed by the Syrian Jews if they proceed, right? So you have a strange sort of prophecy that if Muhammad comes back to Syria, he will be killed there. Abu Talib returns back to Mecca with his nephew. Later Islamic writers gave the rabbi the name of Bahira. This Islamic tradition is hard to account for, considering that the later Islamic tradition says Muhammad died in Medina. So it's kind of like a strange echo of something that might have occurred in an early tradition, and they've left it in thinking it's not that significant. But it's only relevant and true if he actually does die in Syria, you know? So that's my clue number one. Clue number two. The Greek chronicle of Theophanes, written in the beginning of the 9th century and therefore before Ibn Hashim's redaction of the Sirah, indicates that Muhammad died due to his slaughter or wounding. So that's where that comes from, which would likely suggest he died in battle and not by poisoning, as Ibn Ishaq ibn Hashim suggests. Okay, so that's just a very small clue, but slaughter or wounding would suggest, I believe, something like a sword wound or an axe wound or something like that, rather than a poisoning. And so clue three comes from the Historia de Muhammad, which is a brief biography of Muhammad that came into circulation prior to the 850s in Spain. Okay, so this appears to be quite late.
Before you read this source, because
Yeah.
this is where things get very interesting, I just want to point out that the traditional story of Muhammad being poisoned by a Jewish woman is so ridiculous that and here, and he said, he said that he wanted to die a martyr, and here these external sources are making him die in battle. It's like, these are the sources you should want to do Muslims, but you'll quickly see why the story that probably, or that has more of a chance of being historically reliable, was discarded, and they need to come up with anything whatsoever to make Muhammad die in a different way. So they came up with this ridiculous idea that he ate the poison food that he was being served by someone whose family he had just killed. Yeah, that sounds real plausible.
Yeah. And actually, what I'm going to tell you, actually, this story has been suppressed for 1400 years. So I would think that 99.9% of Muslims have never heard this story. It was probably the most successful suppression of a tradition ever created. And the other thing I would say as well is a very common tactic in the Hadith and the Sirah is they throw down a smoke bomb to distract people. And the juicier the story, the better. And then people just think, well, it's so like soap opera, they must be true. But actually, there's some clever people inventing these stories. They know what they're doing.
So what does the Historia tell us?
Okay, so As I said, it came into circulation in Spain in the 850s in Spain and recalls the early tradition that Muhammad lived on past the conquest of Palestine, as we've already explained. So it is likely based on a source from the 7th century. That's going to be important. It tells us that when Muhammad sensed the approach of his death, he predicted that he would be resurrected 3 days after his death by the angel Gabriel. Following his death, Muhammad's followers maintained a vigil guarding his body. Oops, I'll just come back 1 second. Let me see. We'll have to edit this bit out later another time. Following his death, Muhammad's followers maintained a vigil guarding his body and awaiting his resurrection. When 3 days later this did not transpire, Muhammad's body began to stink, and his followers convinced themselves that their presence was preventing the angel's appearance. Does that sound familiar? So they left the body alone, and immediately, instead of angels, dogs followed the stench and devoured his flank. His disappointed followers then buried what was left of the body. The Syriac versions of the Bahira story or legend share a similar story, according to which Muhammad declared himself the Paraclete. By consequence, it seems his followers expected that 3 days after his death, he would go up to heaven to Christ who sent him. When he died, they brought his body to a large house and sealed it inside. 3 days later, they returned only to find that they could not even enter the house on account of the stench of Muhammad's rotting corpse. There is also the indication that his followers don't know where his body was buried, which would suggest that the tradition is earlier than Ibn Ishaq's account, as by that time, which would be this 760s, Medina was established as the place of his burial. So this story would definitely indicate a very early source. Likewise, an early Islamic tradition says Umar resisted having Muhammad buried in hopes of his resurrection. So there's another indication. Until Al-Abbas intervened to insist on his burial, noting that Muhammad's corpse had begun to stink. So these are 3 early Islamic sources, all pointing to the idea that they didn't rush his burial, and likely because they thought he was going to rise from the dead. It's funny how your cat appeared when we're talking about Muhammad's dead body.
It's like what, a dog ate his body?
Yeah.
Before we go on,
Yeah.
when you first presented this material on your channel, it seemed so ridiculous, so different than anything we've ever heard before, that I was very hesitant to think that there was any chance this could be true whatsoever. But then I did some research on my own, and I found that the sources that contain this story get a whole lot of things right about Muhammad that is consistent with Islamic sources. And it's just
Yeah.
this one point that they disagree on. And then you also have the early tradition you referred to, which is kind of a cleaned up version of it. It was Umar who said, "Don't bury Muhammad," but then we did anyway. So that's kind of like,
Yeah.
the cleaned up version of what happened.
Yeah. And if Muslims want to prove that what I'm saying is wrong, they can quite happily dig underneath the Medina Mosque to find his body, and I'd be quite happy to take back what I've just said. But the early Islamic traditions say otherwise,
Definitely. So if we're looking at this tradition, on the plus side, there's the idea that Muhammad died a martyr, yay! But then, of course, there's this embarrassing story, and you have some tie-ins to how that might relate to Christianity and how it would show that Muhammad was a false prophet, and that's why it was suppressed.
Yeah. So I suppose the question is, why would they have suppressed this tradition that predates Ibn Ishaq's? Well, first of all, it shows that, as Jesus said, those who live by the sword will die by the sword. So in one sense, he's condemned by the fact he dies by the sword. The other thing is, this story was suppressed also because the false prophet Jezebel in the Bible was also eaten by dogs, which is quite an embarrassing similarity. I quote from 1 Kings 21:23, and also concerning Jezebel, the Lord says, dogs will devour Jezebel by the wall of Jezreel. And again in 2 Kings 9:10, as for Jezebel, dogs will devour her on the plot of ground at Jezreel, and no one will bury her, and so on. You can also look at 2 Kings 9:36. Nevertheless, I have this against you, says Revelation 2:20. You tolerate that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophet. By her teaching, she misleads my servants into sexual immorality and the eating of food sacrificed to idols. So there you have it. If Muhammad is connected to Jezebel, well, the Bible condemns him
Yeah,
for misleading his servants.
yeah, I was actually going to bring that up, that Revelation brings Jezebel back as kind of the personification of evil. And here we have Muhammad, also from a Christian perspective, the personification of evil. It's kind of a little, not saying absolutely that's what Revelation's referring to, but it is very interesting nonetheless.
Yeah. The other thing I find interesting is Al-Bukhari has a few anti-dog hadith. Now, I know there is Zoroastrian reasons for these, but there could potentially be echoes of this story that's involved in these hadith. So, for example, Ibn as-Sabak said, Maymuna told me that Jibril, peace be upon him, said to the Messenger of Allah, we angels do not enter a house in which there is a dog or a picture. The next day, the Messenger of Allah commanded that all dogs be killed, even small dogs. This to me sounds like the early Muslims had it against dogs, you know. Another one, that the Messenger of Allah said, whoever acquires a dog, with the exception of a dog to guard livestock, a hunting dog, or a farm dog, each day a karat is deducted from his reward. And another one, I heard the Messenger of Allah raising his voice and commanding that dogs be killed, and dogs were killed except for hunting dogs or dogs kept for herding livestock. So you can see, and those are just three examples, there's a certain anti-dog tradition in the Islamic sources.
And just to point out that that first one especially really ties in with what we heard about Muhammad, that they were waiting for the angels to appear and take him away, and then they're like, maybe us being here is why the angels aren't coming. Let's go away. And then a dog came and ate him. And it's like, kind of like you got all three of those elements in this hadith here.
Absolutely,
So
that's
there's a
good.
good possibility that it could be tied into that. And then they changed the story a little, then and said, oh, it was just that one time. Remember when Jibril wouldn't appear? That dog story has nothing to do with his death whatsoever. We made up a different story.
Well, you know that even to this day, Muslims believe that if they are praying and a dog enters the room, that their prayers are cancelled by the presence of a dog, which is crazy. So tradition seems to have outlived the time, you know?
Yeah, I mean, there's got to be a really strong reason to not like dogs. Just, I mean, they made up a good story as to why. I mean, Muhammad couldn't get any revelation that day, so that's why Muhammad hated dogs so much. But you'd think that his response would be something like, "Don't let dogs into your house," not "Kill every dog you can find."
Yeah, it's a bit extreme. I would say that what all this adds up to is that his story had to be radically changed to make him more palatable, pardon the pun. The early date was designed to cover up his dying in Palestine and the dog incident, right? So I'm suggesting that this story was so damaging that they were willing to basically wipe out 4 years of his life to hide all of this, all the traces of him being in Syria and dying by sword and being eaten by a dog. So this is a huge reason behind the distortion that's there in the Hadith and the Sirah. But the key thing there as well is that Ibn Ishaq or Hisham slipped up by saying Bahira foretold the young Muhammad that if he returned to Syria, he would be killed there, which is strange considering that he dying in Syria was not included in the story, you know. So that's kind of a bit of a mess up there.
Definitely.
I don't know if there's anyone who wants to ask a question. I can take a question if before I move on, or happy to move on.
Sure. I'll throw it open to the audience for questions, but while they're thinking about any questions, because there's a slight delay, why don't you go ahead and summarize just the death portion of the story?
Let me just go back to there. Okay, so he said before he died he would rise again from the dead in 3 days. In the farce that followed, his body began to rot. Thinking the angel Gabriel would come, thinking the angel Gabriel wouldn't come while they were there, they left his body unattended. Dogs came in and ate a flank out of it. This story was suppressed because the false prophet Jezebel was also eaten by dogs. Yet this survived in 2 non-Islamic traditions. There are echoes of this story in the Hadith. The angel Gabriel doesn't enter a room where a puppy is. The reference to Umar's delay in burying Muhammad is also echoed in there. Now, actually, when I say yet survived in 2 non-Islamic traditions, I think I meant to say 2 Islamic traditions there, so my mistake. The other thing is his body was probably buried somewhere in Syria and not in Medina, and the location was forgotten. So that's quite a huge thing. If you think about the millions of Muslims that have visited Medina thinking Muhammad was buried there, and he's likely not to have been.
Very good. First, I want to give a shout out to Night Prowler. He noticed the connection with Jezebel before you covered that, so good job there.
Yeah, well done.
Hans asks, what do you think of the Petra origin of Muhammad?
Yeah, what I would say is it makes perfect sense that, let me see, that they pray towards Petra. I believe that whole side of things. And actually, Petra is on the route between Medina and Palestine. So it's likely that he would have stopped off in Petra on his travels. So I think that makes perfect sense. So I'm a big supporter on that. I have spoken to Dan Gibson on a number of things, and I would be in full support in terms of that. I think the theory needs to be developed further, and I think there's a number of layers to it. I think Mesopotamia has got a large part to play in the overall formation of Islam under the Umayyads. And the Syriac connection mustn't be underestimated either. So it's more complex than just Petra, but I think probably a lot of your viewers realize that.
Very good. Related question from Mr. Justinianus. He says, how does the material presented today tie in with the Qibla pointing to Petra?
That's a good question. I don't think it neither supports or contradicts Petra. I think the whole overall story fits better, I would say, with Petra than Mecca. The fact that so much of the story is legendary would suggest that Mecca is probably a part of that legend as well. But just on the face of it, I'll probably have to go away and think about what the Petra connection is. But I think it fits much better. If we hold the idea of Muhammad meeting Khadija and she was a trader, well, if she was living in Petra, I would suggest that would make more sense because it is on the pathway between Medina and Palestine. So that would still work, I would say, better than Mecca does. Mecca's off the beaten track. There's a lot of problems with Mecca, but I won't go into it now. But Patricia Crona has done brilliant work on that and how unfeasible it is to have trade passing through Mecca. Okay.
Very good. RD asks, why does Islam hate Jews so much?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think they originally had a warm relationship with the Jews, and I think under the Abbasids it became very cold. And there might be a number of reasons. I think one of the reasons might be that they viewed the Jews as no longer necessary as part of the alliance. So the The Jews were important in the early days. I think without them, it would have been difficult for Muhammad to achieve what he had done. He obviously needed as many people on board as possible. But the new kids on the block basically didn't want to be sharing their power with a Jewish alliance, so they were very happy to relegate people like the Jews to a lower status. And it wasn't just the Jews, of course. The Christians were demonized later as well, as more and more people became part of this new religion called Islam. But it's very important to understand that really Islam didn't exist for at least 100 years from the time of Muhammad. All that was there in the early days was just a vague monotheism, which was very ecumenical and very open to different peoples. But the Abbasids and the later Umayyads quickly put an end to that hippie stuff.
Very good. Fishbones asks, what about St. John of Damascus? What does he say about Muhammad?
Yeah, I think John of Damascus, I haven't got his source in front of me, but it struck me that he believed a lot of the later tradition that the Muslims were putting out there. I think he got some of the details right, but I think he bought some of the story as well. Like, for example, the story of Zayd and Zainab, which I believe is a fictional story. I think he bought that hook, line, and sinker because he didn't see what was up, you know. I'm not going to go into too much detail with that, but I believe that story was there to prove that Muhammad neither had real biological children or adopted children. And that story was there to prove that, you know, with the abolishment of adoption. And there's also an anti-Christian element to that as well, because it's basically saying that Christians can't be adopted children of God by extension. So, but otherwise, I think his source is very useful in sort of indicating that the the Quran hadn't been brought together yet when he was writing, which I think was in the 740s, if I'm not mistaken.
Very good. I think that takes care of the questions. I'll keep an eye out for some more. So if you guys have any other questions, go ahead and put those in chat. But if you want to continue by telling us how Muhammad earned his nickname, the Praised One.
Yeah, my case is that despite being labelled by the Jews as crazy and possessed, he earned the title the Praised One for two main reasons. First of all, he was a brilliant military strategist, and he was uniquely gifted at creating consensus among the various religious and political factions. And actually, I think this is one part of Muhammad that actually I think, you know, I would have to honestly say, yeah, he was praiseworthy. He deserved praise at least for this. There may be other aspects of his life that wasn't praiseworthy, but I think if I'm being fair, I think he was. So clue one would be he was a brilliant military strategist. This is suggested by the following, and I'm taking this from the Hispanic Chronicle this time, which is dated from 754. So it's about 10 years before Ibn Ishaq's Sirah. It says, the Saracens rebelled in 618, the 7th year of the Emperor Heraclius, and appropriated for themselves Syria, Arabia, and Mesopotamia. And this is the key bit, more through trickery than through the power of their leader Muhammad. And they devastated the neighbouring provinces, proceeding not so much by means of open attacks as by secret incursions. Thus, by means of cunning and fraud rather than by power, they incited all of the frontier cities of the empire and finally rebelled openly, shaking the yoke from their necks. In 618, the 7th year of Heraclius, the warriors invaded the kingdom, which they forcefully appropriated with many and various consequences. Hat off to Muhammad in this case. He was he was a military genius. He could have been stupid about it and just went into open attack, and he would have been beaten on day one. But what he did was he sent his people in. They mixed with the locals. They basically incited them to rise up with them, and so the Romans didn't know what hit them. And if you have the whole population rising up with these Arabs, who the people of these places would have been able to see as brothers because they spoke a common language. I think that was a fantastic method of winning a war. Now, I'm not pro-war by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, I'm very anti-war, and I don't particularly appreciate the use of violence. But if we look at it objectively, I think that was a very good strategy. So that's one reason I think he earned the title. The other thing is, and this is sort of a corollary. I'm just checking if I've missed something there. Give me 1 second. Have a look. Yeah, I think I know what it is. One corollary is he took advantage of a favorable situation when the Persians and the Byzantines were weakened through long war. He also used the principle of overwhelming force to deter resistance. That's a brilliant military strategy. You take whatever opportunities you get. If the situation is very favorable, you know when to strike. And if you use overwhelming force, particularly in the early days, you don't need to use much force after that. So you eventually cow the populations, and eventually you win. And that's the strategy you use. If I can quote from Robert Hoyland here, he says the following. This is quite a long, relatively long paragraph, but I think it's worth hearing. He says, presumably the Persians who had nominally occupied this region during the years 614 to 628 had been too busy establishing their hold over cities and extending their conquests of Byzantine lands to worry about the security of outlying areas. In such a situation, it is not surprising, as contemporary evidence makes clear that Muhammad's followers had precursors. One chronicle records that in 610 a band of Arabs came out of Arabia into the regions of Syria. They pillaged and laid waste many lands, committed many massacres of men, and burned without compassion or pity. A monk of Mar Saba monastery in the Judean desert tells us that 2 months after the sack of Jerusalem by the Persians in 614, the monks were still unwilling to return to their monasteries in the desert for fear of the Saracens. And a monk from a monastery near Jericho describes the depredations of bands of Hebrews and Saracens. Notice the bands of Hebrews and Saracens, which again is confirmation of the alliance, and it shows that even the monks were afraid. So that military strategy worked in terms of scaring everyone. So the other thing I would say, just in brief, the other genius, if you like, of Muhammad was the fact that he was able to get all of the religious factions united. I won't go into great detail, but you had Monophysites, which are one group of Christians. You had the Nestorians, which were from the Lakhmid area. They had very different points of view. You had Tritius, which were a Monophysite offshoot. You had Byzantine Christians as well. So you got a lot of different groups, and then you had polytheists as well in the mix. He was able to bring them all together under this monotheistic umbrella, and that takes a lot of doing to be able to make those sort of compromises. So he clearly was a genius at being able to proclaim a message that we're able to bring people together, and that's not an easy thing to do. So I think when you add all of that together, I can quite clearly see from the historical record why they would have said he was the praised one. So there we go.
Very good. Shout out to Paul, who says hello from Saudi Arabia.
Oh, cool.
That's pretty cool that someone's watching from Saudi Arabia.
Oh, hello. Haraban, I think is the Arabic of hello.
Very good. So I don't see any further comments or questions from the chat. So if you want to just summarize everything we talked about today, and I will probably cut that part out and put it as a shorter video to encourage people to check out more of your material.
Okay. So the Islamic tradition presents a myth, I would say, about Muhammad. And the true account is this. He was born in Yathrib in 591. He was a merchant, and during his travels to Palestine in 610, he became convinced of monotheism and united everyone around his belief. He believed that he was living in the end times and that the Messiah was soon to come. He was married once to a Jewish woman in 634 as part of a successful alliance with Jewish leaders from Edessa. The Jews considered him a crazy and possessed prophet, while his own people saw in him a gifted military strategist and a unifier of the people. We don't know what his name was before, but his title was Muhammad, the Praised One, and this became his name from then onwards. He died in 636, probably from sword wounds. Dogs ate some of his body, and after an initial delay, his body was buried somewhere in Syria, but its location was forgotten. And that's, in summary, what I've been able to establish from the 7th century and later sources.
And I just want to point out that every single source you looked at today is earlier than the earliest Islamic sources, and we also have independent reason to believe the Islamic sources are not reliable in that they contain clear legendary development, they contain clear borrowing from previous sources, and in many cases they contain material that is impossible to be accurate historically. They talk about things that did not yet exist at Muhammad's time and attribute them to Muhammad.
Yeah.
So
there's one.
Go ahead.
There's one little point I forgot to mention. Some people say, well, how did he manage to this amazing conquest of such a large region in such a short length of time? He must have been an absolute genius. But the blueprint for that was the Persian invasion into Byzantine lands in his lifetime. So just to give you some dates, the Persians conquered Syria in 610, followed by Palestine in 614, Egypt in 619, and Anatolia as far as the walls of Constantinople by 626. Right? So they had the blueprint. It didn't require a genius to work out that they could do the same if they had the numbers and they had the will. So I just thought I'd add that in.
Yeah, the area was already primed for someone to come and take it over.
Absolutely.
Very good. So I think that what the case you presented today, while not definitive, is a lot stronger than any case that could be made for the traditional story about Muhammad, at the very least, and is fairly plausible historically speaking. When we look at history, nothing is ever absolutely certain, but I think that there's a pretty strong case that what you presented is more or less the life of the historical person that became known as the Prophet of Islam and became known as Muhammad.
So thank you very much. I hope people appreciate it, the biography, and hopefully we'll change the encyclopedias one of these days.
Yeah, I think that might be a ways off. These things develop very slowly, but
They do, yeah.
I think that as more and more people look into this, people will definitely come to the appreciation that you can't just take the Islamic traditional history for granted, which is what the vast majority of even non-Muslims do.
And actually, I would just say as well, for any of the Muslims who are watching, there's a huge incentive to look at the historical record, because actually Muhammad comes out a whole lot better than the Hadith or the Sirah present him as. He's, as far as I can tell, he was quite a nice guy overall. He lived quite a good lifestyle. He certainly was very religious, and he didn't seem to have loads of wives, and he doesn't seem to be interested in very young girls either. So there's a lot to go for this.
Very good. So if everyone wants to head over to Sneakers Corner and subscribe, he does this kind of material all the time. This is about 80-90% of his material is this sort of thing. So I encourage you to do that. There is a link in the description box, and I'll put one in the pinned comment as well. And I'm sure Sneakers and I will talk again at some point.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Thank you everyone for watching, and good night.